Whose car is this? Going where? Got any documents? A luxury ride, but with skin that color? Looks suspicious. Who? Calling who? A cabinet secretary? Someone like you knows how to stay quiet, or waiting for family to bail you out? The man made a single call. Code Black Sierra 0. Minutes later, armored vehicles arrived, and in an instant, both officers realized the man they had pinned to the ground was the Pentagon's Chief of Strategic Command. So the question was no longer, who is he? The real question became, how many more black people need to be someone before they are treated like human beings? Which state are you living in? In that place, if a black person gets stopped in the street, who will believe them before it's too late? Watch until the end, because this time, it wasn't justice that won, it was the system that got forced to stop. Nathaniel Braxton pulled over beside an old gas station on the edge of the forest, where a rusted iron sign had only a few faded letters left. Dawn was just breaking. The streetlights hadn't fully gone out. Georgia, in late autumn, carried a crisp chill that made it feel like the whole town was breathing out thin streams of fog. He wasn't in uniform, just a dark blue shirt, khaki pants, and a canvas bag in one hand, with a few cans of dried food and a fresh bottle of milk from the counter. No one paid him any attention, and there was no reason to. He looked like any other middle-aged black man living a quiet life as an ordinary citizen. The young cashier greeted him with a faint, half-polite, half-drowsy smile. Braxton nodded courteously, his gaze landing only where necessary, no extra glances, no awkward pauses. He placed the items on the worn wooden conveyor, nodded when asked if he needed a bag, paid in cash, and walked out with the same even stride that had marked his 30 years in the military. Nothing in his demeanor was boastful, nothing in his behavior raised suspicion. His presence blended into the town's rhythm as though he had always belonged there, even if he had just returned after many years of duty. The road toward the suburbs curved gently, like a fracture winding through the pine trees. His car rolled along slowly with no music, no calls. On the passenger seat lay the old Bible his mother read before bed, and a woolen scarf she had knitted by hand last winter. Now and then he glanced in the rear-view mirror, not out of caution, but from a soldier's habit that never quite fades, even after leaving the battlefield. Everything that morning unfolded with a peace so steady it could be forgotten, until a white and double patrol car appeared on the right, overtook him, then suddenly veered to block the front of his vehicle just before the turn into a residential area. Braxton frowned, eased on the brakes, and kept both hands steady at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. His eyes moved slowly, watching the patrol car's window roll down, then shifting to the young officer stepping out, hand on his belt, eyes sharp with suspicion. The sight wasn't unfamiliar to Braxton. He had seen it hundreds of times in military reports on citizens mistreated without cause, but being the one on the receiving end of that look made him exhale deliberately, as if even his body needed reminding, stay calm. A second officer, seemingly more experienced, exited from the passenger side. Taller, broader, colder eyes, and the way he strode toward Braxton's car made the air tighten. He tapped the window once, then, without waiting, motioned for it to be lowered. Braxton complied, silent. The officer didn't ask why the vehicle had been stopped. No greeting. No mention of license plates or taillights. Just one question. Where are you headed this early? His tone wasn't loud or angry, but carried an invisible weight, as if wearing the uniform entitled him to an answer from anyone who didn't look like him. Braxton turned and replied slowly, I picked up some things for my mother. The officer glanced at the bag through the window, then asked again, is this your car? Mine, he replied evenly. His voice showed no resistance, but no submission either. The officer's eyes flicked to a slim book on the passenger seat. Braxton's hand stayed on the wheel, palms dry, breath steady. He knew, in moments like this, one wrong move was enough to justify a tragedy, and today he would give them nothing, not even a blink too long. The taller officer took the license Braxton had pulled from his old wallet. He scanned it, paused, at Nathaniel A. Braxton, then glanced at the man sitting still behind the wheel. No thanks, no return of the ID, just a quiet fold of the card, and a look toward his partner, still checking the plates. Says anything? Name's Braxton. Address in Virginia. Cars registered in Maryland. Sound right? To whom? The younger one said. Looks like some drifter in a rented ride. Braxton heard it, didn't flinch. The air was cool, the grass damp, but that voice cut colder than the wind. He had faced worse in war zones, but this was different. This suspicion wasn't about what he'd done, it was about who he was. Step out, sir, the lead officer ordered. Braxton didn't argue. He shut off the engine, opened the door, stepped out slowly and clearly like every move had to prove he belonged. He stood tall, arms relaxed, careful not to get too close. Their eyes followed him, hunting for a reason. Luggage? Back seat. Groceries? Milk? The officer didn't ask. He yanked the door, dumped the bag, and sent the milk rolling. A wool scarf unraveled, caught on his boot. He didn't look down. He pulled a small notebook, flipped through it, and tossed it back. What's your job? Just retired. Must be nice. The younger one smirked. Wandering around town like no one needs to know who you are. I don't need to be recognized. Braxton replied, voice steady like issuing a command. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before the lead officer chuckled. Sounds like an old TV drama. The mysterious hero. Braxton didn't react. He had heard all kinds of mockery. Inside war rooms, out on the field, sometimes even from those wearing the same uniform. But standing on a small roadside, under the indifferent glances of a few passers-by while his ID was withheld and his belongings mishandled, stirred something different. Not fear, but warning. I'll need to run further checks. Still no clear reason for him being in this area, the officer said, pressing the radio on his shoulder. Requesting backup, possible suspicious male subject, black, around 60, driving an out-of-state vehicle, possible forged documents. Braxton looked up. Not out of insult, but because he now understood this wasn't about needing a reason, it was about needing an excuse. A second patrol car turned in from a distance, the tires humming softly over gravel. In the commanding officer's hand, Braxton's license was still not returned. The man took a deep breath, his eyes shifting toward the faint lettering on the windshield of the approaching car. The word sheriff appeared behind a thick layer of dust, not as reassurance, but like a warning sign that the morning breeze wasn't bringing relief, only the arrival of a storm. He didn't move, didn't ask when he'd get his ID back. The silence around him wasn't just uncomfortable now, it was deliberate, structured. It carried weight, the kind he had felt before operations overseas, just before a decision that couldn't be reversed. And here, in his own country, that same weight was pressing down on his shoulders, not from war, but from a system that treated presence as provocation. Every breath he took was measured, not to calm himself, but to stay in control of what little space they hadn't yet taken. As the new vehicle rolled closer, Braxton stood rooted, not because he had something to prove, but because stepping back had never been his way. Not then, not now. Raise your hands. Step out of the car. The voice cut through the air like a blow against morning glass. No sirens, no flashing lights, just a command hurled into the space between people, as if it were the final barrier, justifying self-appointed authority. Braxton stepped out slowly. His shoes met the pavement with a low, steady sound that echoed within him. He didn't ask why, didn't demand clarity. He turned, lifted his hands level with his shoulders, palms open outward. A stance more familiar to someone being detained than to a general officer. Phone was lifted from across the street. The woman holding it was middle-aged, her appearance as ordinary as any early morning pedestrian. She stood by the bus stop, eyes narrowing through the lens, remaining completely silent, as if even a whisper could tip the scene out of control. But the silence didn't last. The younger officer spun toward her, voice sharp and rising. Turn that off. You want to get arrested? This is a secured inspection scene. She stepped back, still holding the phone, hands slightly trembling. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Everything unfolding before her and in her frame was saying enough. Braxton was shoved against the hood, his face toward the metal, his back striking the chilled surface, still damp with morning dew. One officer's hand pressed firmly against his shoulder while the other began searching him. Movements rough, unhesitating, not like someone verifying documents, but like someone hunting for evidence to match a verdict already made. One side pocket was opened, then the belt, then the waistline, where he kept his service-issued firearm, registered legally under regulations for high-ranking officers. The officer's hand touched it, paused for a second, then drew it out and placed it on the hood like he had just disarmed a wanted criminal. "Hot piece," he muttered. "This kind's not meant for civilians." Braxton remained still. His back ached, but his eyes never left the far horizon. The sun had fully risen, casting the shadows of all three men onto the cold asphalt. The officer continued searching, running his hands across every pocket, every seam, stopping only when he found a small, worn metal tag tucked neatly in Braxton's chest pocket. "What's this?" he asked, voice laced with suspicion and mockery. Braxton did not answer, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew that any explanation now would be treated like an excuse. The officer picked up the gun and waved it slightly, like a prize. "Get this checked," he told his partner. "Bet the serial number won't match." Then he turned back. Name, though Braxton's license was still in his hand. "Nathaniel Braxton," he answered, calm and steady. "Any record? Ever suspended?" "I commanded the 8th Brigade, Eastern Army Command." The officer frowned, not from understanding, but disbelief. His look at his partner said it all. Braxton didn't flinch. He didn't need belief, just enough control to keep this from going too far. Across the street, the woman was still recording. A man now stood beside her. They didn't speak, but Braxton saw it. Someone was watching, and that was enough to keep him grounded, even when pressed to his limits. "Probably black market," the officer muttered. His words weren't questions, just cuts, carving Braxton into a role already chosen in his mind. The younger cop spun the weapon like a toy, eyes locked on Braxton, waiting, not for cooperation, but for anger or fear, ideally both. Braxton gave him neither. No flash of hurt, no rise in voice, just a quiet so firm it made no room for misreading. His eyes stayed level, not challenging, not avoiding, just steady, a look shaped by years of knowing how quickly even a glance could become a trigger. The moment hung like breath before a shot. Braxton held his ground. Everything he had taught and lived through condensed into stillness, an answer in silence. And in that silence, he gave them nothing. No excuse to escalate, no weakness to exploit, only the strength of someone who knew survival meant holding his line, quiet, calm, and unshaken. The officer smirked. "Someone like you knows how to stay quiet, or waiting for family to bail you out?" He glanced at his partner. They both gave a low chuckle. More people had gathered on the sidewalk. No one dared step forward, but phones were dialing. Eyes flicked between the camera and the cops, trying to capture every detail. The air carried the weight of something about to cross a line, yet no one had the courage, or the authority, to stop it. Only then did Braxton slowly turn to face the officer holding his documents. His voice wasn't loud, wasn't forceful, but it carried like a command inside a barracks. "I'd like to make a call." He didn't say it to plead, nor to calm the scene. It came with the exactness of someone who had already measured every outcome, who knew exactly where he stood and what needed to be triggered before this became a mistake that couldn't be undone. The officer frowned. It wasn't the answer he expected. No resistance, no threats, no lawyer's name, just a neutral statement, so steady it unsettled him. Who? Calling who? A cabinet secretary? He laughed, but the sound was dry, uncertain. Braxton didn't reply. He was waiting, not for permission, but for the right moment. A moment that once missed could never be reclaimed, but if misused, it could end everything badly. The officer looked into his eyes and paused, like trying to read an unspoken language, and for a second, something in that cold clarity behind Braxton's gaze made him freeze, not from fear, but from the sense that he was standing before something no one had taught him how to handle. The wind picked up again, tossing the hair of the woman still filming across the street. The sky seemed to dull, not from clouds, but from the shift happening now. Someone in silence had just asked to make a call, and from that moment on, control might no longer belong to those who thought they held it. A dry, uneven laugh came from the officer on the left, as if he wasn't amused but needed to sound in control. Tilting his head, he pointed to the phone Braxton had just taken from his pocket and spoke in the tone people use when they think they've caught someone doing something wrong. "Calling your lawyer? Or your mom? To come bail you out?" A few chuckles followed from the uniformed men nearby, short laughs with a sharp edge like nails scraping steel. Braxton didn't answer. He looked at the officer for a second, weighing whether it was worth saying anything, then turned to his phone, unlocked it, entered an unsaved number, and brought it to his ear. "This is Braxton, Code Black, Sierra 0. I need confirmation." His voice was calm, each word deliberate, like a line practiced hundreds of times. The sentence landed with the precision of command, not meant for explanation, not meant for show. The nearby officer raised an eyebrow, but before he could respond, the voice on the other end answered, clear, firm, just 3 words. "Where are you?" Those 3 words brought a sudden stillness to the air around Braxton. No one spoke. Those who had expected resistance or outbursts now moved more slowly, as if the scene had shifted out of familiar ground. Braxton tilted his head slightly. "Ashtontown, Monroe County, Southern Georgia. I'm being held." He paused, then added, "No reason. Military firearm confiscated. Badge searched." His voice stayed level, emotionless, but the steadiness of it made something feel off, like the calm before a change no one could stop. On the other end, the voice dropped lower. "Do nothing. We'll handle it." The call ended without a beep, moving with the precision of people used to crisis and to being obeyed. Braxton lowered the phone, slipped it back in his pocket, and looked at the officer, still standing frozen, face now edged with caution. The man glanced at his partner, then at Braxton, but for the first time said nothing. No more smirks, no more sarcasm. None of them fully understood what had just happened, but every one of them could feel it. Something had slipped from their control, and the man they thought they could pin down on an empty street might not have been someone they should have pulled from the car at all. One of them stepped back, pretending to adjust his radio, then walked off, voice lowered as he made a short, urgent call. Their stance had shifted. They no longer looked like an inspection team, but like people waiting for something bigger than they were ready to name. Across the street, the woman still had her phone aimed at the scene. She didn't know who had just been called, nor what those 3 words meant, but her expression had changed. No longer worried, but waiting. In most cases, when someone under pressure is asked to make a call, they choose a lawyer, a relative, or someone for civilian intervention. But this time, everything shifted with just a code and a confirmation that required no explanation. "Who is called with it?" "Mr. Eiffel, if I can step away now." And that alone made those around Braxton realize they may have just detained someone whose name didn't need to be spoken aloud to change everything. The officer didn't wait for the call to end. He stepped forward, fast, rough, and yanked the phone from Braxton's hand, a move that felt more like proving he still had control, even as unease quietly rose inside him. The phone's screen remained lit, the call still active. The voice on the other end had just begun to speak before the sound broke off with the commotion. Then a low, clear voice echoed from the speaker, every word heard by those nearby. "Do not touch equipment issued to the commander of the army." No shouting, no raised tone, no anger, just a sentence, but it landed like a blade of ice, slicing through what noise remained. The hand holding the phone froze midair. The officer's eyes dropped slowly to the device, as if just realizing it didn't belong within his reach. No one laughed, no one moved. Even bystanders on both sides of the street seemed frozen in their tracks. Silence dropped over the street, not empty, but so heavy that even the slightest movement felt excessive. Leaves trembled in the wind, but no one noticed. Dust lifted from the hood of the car, drifting away like smoke, and in that moment, the air itself took on the color of something unfamiliar, real authority. Braxton stayed where he was, gaze unchanged, as if he had known all along this was exactly how it would unfold. He didn't reach for the phone, didn't need to say a word. The voice on the line had said everything. The words had been chosen precisely, briefly, finally, and unquestionably. The officer slowly lowered his hand and placed the phone on the hood, like setting down something that might explode. He didn't pull his hand away too fast, nor did he look away from Braxton, no longer out of suspicion, but because he was now trying to make sense of everything that had just shifted. In that thickening air, only the wind threading through the roadside trees remained, along with the heavy breathing of the very men who had just barked orders at the man now standing silently among them. Someone whispered, "Commander?" as if asking, but no answer came. None was needed. Because sometimes a single sentence, said at the right moment, from the right place, with the right weight, can bring an entire system to a halt, not with force, but with a truth they never expected. And that moment, the space between a hand grabbing and a voice confirming, was when artificial authority got stripped bare by something that didn't need to show off to be real. One of the younger officers glanced at his partner, waiting for direction, but nothing came. No commands. Just quiet glances exchanged, each man silently recalculating what might now be heading their way. The atmosphere no longer belonged to the town, nor the color of their uniforms. It was entirely held by the 3 words that had just been spoken over the phone. No one dared to move, not because of fear, but because they could feel the shift, like watching the tide pull back before the wave returns, stronger, deliberate, irreversible. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but they had seen the wind change. "We followed procedure," the words came out fast, ending with a slight tremor, caught between defense and doubt. The young officer stood straight, eyes scanning around, trying to hold on to a sense of order that had slipped away. He was speaking to Braxton, but more to himself, as if repeating that phrase enough times might make it true. Behind him, the crowd murmured, but didn't move. Phone stayed raised, still recording the figures on the road. The unease wasn't suspicion anymore. It had taken shape, felt in each motion, each radio tap, each glance exchanged between those wearing the same uniform. Braxton didn't turn back right away. He stood still, eyes flicking to the phone on the car hood, screen dark but unmistakably active. A single signal, a word from the other end, could trigger a system far beyond what anyone here could comprehend. When he did turn, his face was unreadable, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had made decisions between life and death, between action and consequence. He looked directly at the officer who had just spoken. His voice wasn't loud or harsh. It came clean and exact, like commands issued from a war room. Wrong protocol, wrong man, wrong moment. The words weren't a threat. They were a diagnosis and a warning. No shouting followed, no debate, but the line was now drawn, clearer than ever, between who truly held power and who only pretended to. The officer swallowed hard. He started to speak, but the words stalled. The terms once used with ease in routine stops, suspicious, comply, standard procedure, now felt hollow. 3 sharp, undeniable statements had just cut through that armor of language. Around them, the road stayed quiet. The breeze wasn't strong, but enough to carry the weight of something shifting, slow but heavy. The woman with the phone had lowered it, but no one left. They remained, not to watch chaos, but because their instincts told them this mattered, and being present was no longer optional. It was part of the story. Braxton bent to retrieve his phone, brushed off the dust, and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't glance at anyone, didn't issue commands, but each move, every step he took back toward the car made it clear the real battle wasn't here, not on this stretch of town road, and it certainly wasn't only his to fight. One of the older officers spoke, quietly but loud enough for the others to hear. "We need to call the higher-ups." The other gave a slight nod. No paperwork was filed, no official statement exchanged, but the look they shared needed no signature. It was acknowledgement. No one repeated standard procedure anymore, because sometimes clinging to the wrong process is the fastest way to lead an entire system off course. And today, in the middle of a small, usually quiet town, someone had stepped out of a car and asked the questions no one had dared voice for years. An engine rumbled from the end of the street. First a low vibration, then louder, overtaking even the quiet footsteps of bystanders inching closer. A black armored SUV, no plates, no lights, surged forward like a steel line cutting through town. The tires screeched over the asphalt, sharp and final like a command. It stopped less than 5 meters from Braxton. The front door opened before the engine fully shut down. 2 men stepped out fast, their movements sharp, dressed in plain dark clothing, no visible insignia, no clear rank, but their presence alone compressed the scene into a single vertical tension line, making all other motion feel unnecessary. One of them reached into his inner jacket and pulled out a small, weighty object, holding it straight out toward the local officers. The sunlight hit the metal just right, reflecting every etched letter. DOD, Strategic Command Division. He was of average build, his face unreadable, his eyes nearly devoid of expression, and when he spoke, his voice was low, but carried an unmistakable chill that crept into the spines of those near. Release General Braxton, now. The appearance was too sudden, too well-timed, too definitive. It threw the entire group of officers off balance. One stepped back half a pace, and another instinctively touched his belt in a reflex of defense. The young officer, still holding the firearm taken from Braxton, looked back and forth between his superior and the 2 men who had just arrived, unsure how to react, and passed through, lifting the hem of the man's blazer just enough to reveal the grip of a gun holstered behind him, unconcealed, because there was nothing left to hide. An older local officer, seemingly the head of that day's patrol, stepped forward half a pace, trying to maintain composure, though his stance had lost its firmness. "We haven't been able to verify his identity," he said, his voice laced with both justification and fear. "No military plates, no uniform, no security detail. Our procedure requires a check." The man holding the badge didn't move. He gave a slight tilt of his head toward Braxton, then turned back to the officer and replied, flatly, "No need. We've already confirmed with the Pentagon." No one argued this time. Those words carried weight not from tone, but from the system they represented. Once a name has been confirmed through strategic command, there is no room left for doubt. The arrest had slipped beyond local jurisdiction long before, but only now did it become visibly, unmistakably clear. Braxton remained where he was, shoulders squared, chin level, face unreadable. He looked at the 2 men as if they were old colleagues. No need for more words. They hadn't come to ask. They had come to end the silence a privilege-soaked system had just created. The young officer placed the gun on the hood, his hand beginning to shake. He glanced across the street, where citizens still held their phones in recording mode, but now the pressure didn't come from cameras. It came from the shadow of the man before them, a man they had treated like a suspect, now validated by the highest authority they had ever read about in textbooks. The intervention leader gave Braxton a slight nod, a confirmation that everything had been handled exactly as requested. No protocols followed, no handshake, no salute, because this wasn't a reception. It was a reminder that some names need no introduction, and some truths are big enough to erase any illusion of temporary power. The young officer stood upright, his right hand reaching into his pocket to retrieve the key. His movements were slow, slightly clumsy. The metal clicked as the lock turned, separating the cuffs that had gripped the wrists of a man he had failed to recognize, even after standing face to face with him for nearly 20 minutes. When the cuffs came off, the hand holding them still trembled faintly. He tensed his arm to steady himself, trying to rebuild the stern expression of someone enforcing the law, but his eyes had already shifted. He knew it, and so did the crowd watching. No one would believe in that hardness now, not even he did. Braxton stepped back slightly and slowly raised a hand to rub the wrist just been freed. The faint mark on his skin was the only trace left from a series of actions others called protocol. He didn't look at the officer, didn't demand an apology. His gaze moved past him, settling on the hood of the car, where something small caught the sunlight. He bent down and picked up the military badge that had fallen during the search. The familiar piece of metal now carried a visible scratch along the lower edge, right through the engraved identification number. It wasn't large, but deep enough to break the surface. Braxton quietly wiped off the dust with his sleeve and held it in his palm, as if restoring the last piece of order for himself. One of the military officers from the intervention team stepped forward. His voice was low, clear, and steady, just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear without needing to raise it. "That scratch will not be polished out," he said, eyes on the badge in Braxton's hand. "It will remain as part of the federal security record." Braxton looked up, his gaze calm and unwavering. They said nothing more. That sentence was not just about the object. It was a statement that what happened would not be erased, not scrubbed from the system just because the ones who were wrong realized it too late. That scratch, small as it seemed, had become a mark of record, an identifier for a misstep the system was now required to remember, because next time the person pulled over in the middle of a street might not have a chance to call anyone at all. Behind them, the townspeople stayed. The woman lowered her phone but kept watching, not out of anger now, but awareness. She had just witnessed something real, not a scuffle, not a routine stop, but a crack between what is allowed and what is right, made visible through a man who never should have been in cuffs. The young officer who had removed them stood still. He looked at Braxton's badge, then away. For one moment he let go of the role he had performed, and maybe in his mind one question kept repeating, "Why didn't I see it sooner?" Braxton walked toward his car. Each step landed with quiet meaning. The men with him didn't lead or follow. They walked beside him, steady, silent. They knew what needed guarding now wasn't the image, but a deeper code of duty inside a system that had just been forced to reflect. Wind moved down the street again, this time not with dust, but with the strange stillness of something being reset, without guns, without shouts, only by a man who stood tall when everything tried to reduce him. Tires rolled slowly from a side street, drawing out the silence. More people appeared, some from stores, some from corners, some from porches. They didn't push, they didn't speak. They simply stood, watching. A boy on a bike skidded to a stop at the edge. He stared at the black suits, the armored car, and the gun on the hood. No one explained, but he knew something serious had happened, and it didn't match what they said about this town. Braxton turned to face them. He didn't claim a moment. He didn't speak like someone demanding justice. He stood, eyes meeting theirs, letting them decide what they'd just seen, what it meant. A statement hung in the air, unspoken. But when he did speak, it was quiet, simple, and enough. "I don't want a crowd," he said. "I want silence that can be heard." A woman near the front, the one who had filmed from the beginning, gave a slight nod and stepped back. A few others lowered their phones. The silence spread like an unspoken order that no one gave, but everyone understood. They weren't told to stay quiet. They were invited to feel. And then Braxton walked away. No sound rose from those left behind. No applause, no cheering, no one called his name. He passed the men who had ordered his arrest, past the car that still bore the mark of his hands on the hood. The two young officers, the ones who cuffed him, who pressed down on his shoulders, now stood motionless, faces stiff under the midday sun. One pressed his lips together, the other dropped his eyes, sweat lining his brow. Braxton didn't look at them, but he didn't avoid them either. He didn't return their gaze, yet each step he took etched something into the pavement they wouldn't soon forget. Some failures don't echo, but they linger. Some encounters end without words, but follow you for the rest of your life. He left the scene without followers, leaving no message behind except the steadiness he held after everything unjust. The intervention officers returned silently to their vehicle. No signals, no closing remarks. The car door shut like the final period of a short chapter that would not be erased from the memory of anyone present. The noon sun lit every strand of hair, every stretch of pavement, every scratch on the badge still in Braxton's pocket. But what stood out most was the light that framed the two uniformed men still in the street, more exposed now than ever. They weren't fired, weren't handcuffed, but they had lost something no internal report could restore. The trust that comes with a first glance, and the town, once so sure of its quiet, had just learned that some silences don't mean peace, but that someone, at last, had stood up and said what should have been heard long ago, without ever raising his voice. The next morning, just as the sun rose over the eastern ridge, the Monroe County Police Department received a sealed envelope via express courier from the Department of Justice. There was no sender listed, only a bold printed label, Urgent Processing, Administrative Code 11C, ASCC. Chief Whitaker received the file at 7:14 a.m., still holding his coffee, untouched. He read the first line of the cover sheet, froze, and immediately ordered an emergency assembly of all mid-level commanders and patrol officers involved in the incident from the previous afternoon. The second-floor meeting room was too small for everyone, but Whitaker didn't wait for suggestions. The door closed, blinds drawn. Bright white lights revealed every face. Most were familiar, men in uniform. But today each looked tenser than usual. Whitaker remained standing, holding a remote in front of the wall-mounted screen. He played a satellite military recording. The frame showed a quiet street, 2 white and blue patrol cars, and a black SUV pulled over. The top-down angle still revealed facial expressions and hand movements. When one officer drew a gun from the older man, the video froze. The room went silent. Whitaker turned, his tone sharp. Who authorized action at this level without confirming his identity? No one answered. He turned back and resumed the clip. The video played through the moment the armored SUV arrived. 2 men stepped out, and a military badge flashed in the sun. When the words, "We've already confirmed with the Pentagon," played, Whitaker shut the screen off. He set the remote down and faced the team. "I want to hear it from your mouths. Why didn't anyone ask his name before cuffing him?" An older officer near the door responded, voice shaky. "We thought he was a regular man. No military plates. Showed nothing unusual." A whisper came from the far corner, quiet, nearly lost, but it brought the room to a halt, because he looked like any of the others. No one identified who said it. The words seemed to escape before the speaker even realized, but the impact could not be taken back. Every eye turned toward the sound. Some glanced away, some bowed their heads. The truth had surfaced, not in a report, but in the room's subconscious, where real reasons are often buried beneath protocol. Whitaker clenched his fists and spoke through tight lips. "And that is exactly why we're here this morning." He didn't need to say more. He didn't need to assign blame. That accidental admission had already laid bare the heart of it all. Prejudice had run so deep it had become reflex, turning a man who should have been received with honor into a perceived threat. He stepped toward the window and gently pulled back the curtain. Outside, the town moved on. People filled the streets, cars rolled over pavement, and the cafe on the corner still hung its open sign. But inside this room, something had cracked, not from the Department of Justice, but from within their ranks. Turning back, his voice lowered. "Justice will request every file, including traffic stops from the past 3 months. We'll have to open everything. And if any pattern shows up among those detained without legitimate cause, you all know what that means." No one replied. But each man felt it clearer than ever. Yesterday's incident was not the end. It was the beginning of things that could no longer be buried under the name of procedure. That sentence didn't pass like a careless sigh. It struck the walls, echoed along the ceiling, and dropped to the table where the case files lay. Everyone in the room heard it, even if they pretended not to. No one repeated it. But it lingered, staining the air like spilled ink across a white surface, impossible to erase or hide. In that moment, inside the thick silence of the curtained room, those words returned like a silent shot fired into the honor of the entire force. No explosion, no bullet, just 6 words spoken on instinct, cutting deeper than any report ever dared. The honor they recited during oath ceremonies was now unraveling in how they looked at others, not by behavior, not by facts, but by skin color. Chief Whitaker stood before the whiteboard, eyes fixed on the phrase, "procedure failure," written in marker. It had been added this morning. a placeholder in the investigation. But now he knew it wasn't right anymore. It wasn't enough. Procedure failure sounded like a technical glitch, a wrong address, a clerical slip. What had happened and what was now under scrutiny was far beyond that. He looked around the room, mid-level officers scattered across chairs, some faces old, some young, many of them peers from his earliest years in the force. No one was defensive now. No one scrambled for excuses. The room was quiet, but not at peace. Each man seemed exposed by his silence, eyes fixed on the table, hands clenched unconsciously on knees, all reflecting one truth they had long avoided. The problem wasn't outside, it had been inside them all along. Whitaker took a breath, stepped to the table, and placed both hands on its cold surface. His fingers shook slightly, anger long compressed. We always thought this kind of thing happened somewhere else, big cities, where politics mixed with policing. But this time, it was here. No one told you to cuff him. No one told you to draw your guns. So, who made you act like that? No one spoke. He didn't need a name. The question wasn't aimed at one person, but at a way of thinking, an instinct shaped by years of repetition. A system passed through training, through stories, through silent nods when someone said, "Looks suspicious." In that silence, Whitaker understood. The arrest of Nathaniel Braxton wasn't a mistake or rookie error. It was the product of a culture that judged first and asked later. A culture so embedded it didn't need orders, because it had already become law beneath the law. He felt a sharp weight in his chest, not fear of fallout, but the sting of seeing through a belief he'd held for too long, that justice and honor could coexist if everyone just followed protocol. But now he knew, honor isn't found in rules, it's found in the choices people make, and this time, they chose wrong, not from ignorance, but from habit. 3 days after the incident in Ashton, a short article appeared on a little-known political news site, followed mostly by insiders for its speed and discretion. In it, an unnamed journalist quoted a senior military source suggesting the traffic stop and arrest of General Nathaniel Braxton was part of a manufactured narrative to manipulate public opinion on racial bias within the military and local law enforcement. The story spread fast, not for its credibility, but because of the name. An active 3-star general, former commander of over 100,000 troops, now being smeared by a hidden hand. The leak sparked waves of speculation. Several conservative outlets repeated the phrase "media setup" as if it were verified truth. Anonymous accounts twisted the story. Braxton had purposely dressed down to spark outrage. His rescuers were private contractors, and the video was staged. The chaos didn't change the facts, but it blurred the lines between real and false, just as the source had hoped. It didn't take long for the Department of Defense to trace the leak to Colonel Mason Wilcox, a former officer once disciplined directly by Braxton 3 years earlier during an internal probe into budget misuse at a combat training unit in Texas. Though never demoted, Wilcox lost his promotion track and was reassigned away from Strategic Command, a post he'd viewed as his career stronghold. Wilcox had never spoken out publicly, but resentment had simmered. Seeing Braxton celebrated as a model of military integrity only deepened it. When the Ashton incident broke, Wilcox saw his chance to strike back. Under the guise of a casual leak, he sent distorted details to a friendly journalist. He chose a small outlet, enough to stir attention but too minor to face serious fact-checking. He believed the story could be spun as a controversial episode, rather than a grave misconduct. But what Braxton realized, or chose to ignore, was that Braxton never relied on reputation for defense. He prepared, not for self-protection, but because he believed a soldier's honor isn't built on statements, it's built on records, evidence, and action. Immediately after the first internal hearing, Braxton submitted the full audio recording of his call on the day of his arrest to both the Pentagon and the Justice Department. The device he used was a specially encrypted military-grade phone with a self-contained storage system built to strategic standards. Every outgoing call, signal command, and response was backed up to 3 secure locations within 3 minutes of transmission. The recording detailed every step: his direct call to the internal line, personal ID code verification, report of his unlawful detainment, and the confirmation and dispatch of a rapid response unit. No edits, no missing words. His voice, steady, clear, was captured with indisputable clarity. Within 4 hours of the recording's internal release, Wilcox's narrative collapsed. News outlets retracted the story. Some issued vague corrections. Conspiracy-laced commentary disappeared, replaced by outrage aimed at the man who fabricated it. For Braxton, it wasn't a victory. He made no public statement. He sent a single internal message to his advisory group at the department. When truth is preserved, there's no need to shout to be heard. You just open it at the right time. The original clip, 18 minutes long and pulled from encrypted military phone data, was meant for internal review only, shared via a restricted access link. But within hours, it slipped beyond conference rooms and strategy offices. Someone inside the Department of Justice, whether intentionally or by mistake, forwarded it to an independent investigative media outlet. And like all truths long silenced in darkness, it began to find its way to the light. No edits, no titles, no narration, just raw footage. An older man, standing tall in the street, handcuffed. His firearm lay on the hood like a trophy. The officer's voice echoed with mockery. Probably got it off the black market. Then, the call. Braxton's voice, every word clear, even, "This is Braxton. Code Black, Sierra 0. I need confirmation." The clip didn't need drama. There were no struggles, no gunshots. But the truth in it was so plain that every excuse collapsed. Each second became evidence against the narrative that right-wing media had tried to spin for 3 days. When the responder on the other end said, "Where are you, sir?" social media exploded. And when the special ops officer's voice entered, ending with, "We've already confirmed with the Pentagon," all debate stopped. Pro-law enforcement forums went silent. Articles accusing Braxton of staging the event were taken down. But the internet has no undo button. Millions shared the original clip, no captions, just one hashtag, Black Sierra 0. The wave didn't stay civilian. At Virginia Military Institute, a group of young officers held a private gathering with graduating cadets and veterans who had once served under Braxton. In a room lined with insignias and portraits, one phrase was repeated, not from a manual, but from a long-ago exchange when Braxton led Eastern Command. A white former captain stood. No notes, no phone. He looked straight at the younger men. "He taught me to stay silent, not out of fear, but to wait for the right moment." Silence wasn't about hiding, it was about not wasting the truth. And then, when the time came to speak, he taught me to break that silence without asking permission. There was no applause, no further comment, but the session ran long. No one left early. Quiet stories emerged of a general who inspected barracks unannounced, who ate with privates to hear them speak freely, who reminded officers not to forget the names of night guards, and most of all, a man who once said, "We don't need respect because of our rank. We need to look in the eye for how we treat those below us." The video didn't end in heroics. It ended with Braxton walking away in silence, alone, needing no backing. And that moment became the symbol not of triumph, but of something rarer. A man in power facing injustice like a soldier, without display, without defense, simply by holding the truth. And truth, once it stands, will speak when the time is right. 4 days after the original clip spread across social media, an open letter was sent to all major news outlets with a simple title, "I've seen it before." The author signed clearly, James Holloway, a retired police lieutenant with over 30 years of service in the state of Georgia. In the letter, he recounted an incident from the 1990s in a small town less than 60 miles from Ashton. A black man was arrested in the street for being suspicious, beaten, and tied to a utility pole for over 20 minutes before it was confirmed he was a doctor returning home from a long hospital shift. He lived 3 more days before dying from untreated internal bleeding. I saw something like this once, But none of those men survived, Holloway wrote, using his real name, not asking for anonymity. I stayed silent. I thought being a bystander meant I wasn't responsible. But when I watched the video of General Braxton, I realized my silence helped create the cycle. The letter became the lead story on that night's national news. It was read in full, no dramatic music, no reenactments. The anchor's voice trembled slightly toward the end. Some called it a late confession. Others called it a needed turning point. But no one denied it had done what many internal reviews had failed to do. It made it feel like this was no longer one man's problem, or one department's, or one city's. It was the exposed layer of something the public had grown too used to ignoring. Around the same time, the boy who filmed the incident, a 13-year-old middle schooler, was interviewed by a major Atlanta-based newspaper. He sat on a small sofa, still a bit shy but with bright eyes. When the reporter asked why he started recording early, while most others were still unsure what was happening, his answer brought the entire studio to a quiet pause. I filmed because he didn't say anything, he replied without hesitation, and I knew people who don't speak are usually the ones that matter. They don't need to talk to get attention, they just stand still and everyone looks. The anchor paused before continuing. The clip of the boy's words was shared millions of times within hours, not because it was cute, but because it captured something adults often avoid admitting. Children see the truth faster than we think. They don't need context or statistics. They understand with instinct. And that instinct, if nurtured, might be the beginning of justice. After the interview, the school where he studied organized a new discussion on recognizing and responding to wrongdoing in public. For the first time, it wasn't led by teachers or legal experts, but by students themselves. He told his story simply, without embellishment, just what he saw and why he started recording. That simplicity made every adult in the room fall silent, not from sentiment, but from a sense of loss. The realization that somewhere along the way, they had lost something. The ability to recognize right from wrong directly, without systems, without needing permission, without waiting for power to speak first. From a clip filmed by a child and a late confession from a retired officer, the story of Braxton had moved beyond an administrative mishap. It became a doorway, opening to things that had never been properly named, not because people had suddenly grown braver, but because truth now had a face, a voice, and a generation learning not to repeat what their elders once ignored. Mayor Robert Langley sat behind an old oak desk in the town hall. A room usually reserved for procedural meetings was now packed with reporters, cameras, and waiting eyes. For 4 days he had said nothing. His office had said nothing. No official statement had been released since the incident, but public pressure was building fast. Crowds gathered outside city headquarters each day, standing silently, as if their presence alone was weight enough to demand a response. That afternoon, Langley appeared before the cameras in a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled, no tie. He looked straight into the lens, voice deeper and wearier than usual, but each word clear. "We've been late to speak, and I won't offer excuses. We saw what happened, along with the rest of the country. What was done to General Braxton was a serious wrong, but if we call it just a mistake, we miss the most dangerous part of this." He paused, scanning the press, then continued. "Justice doesn't wear a uniform, but injustice always has a face. And here, that face has been seen as normal for far too long." The room fell quiet. His words were quoted verbatim on major front pages. Some praised him for speaking the truth. Others called it political damage control. But whatever the motive, it marked the start of questions the town had never confronted directly. That night, national broadcasts led with a blunt headline. "If he wasn't a general, would we know this happened?" The question hit like a hammer against the shell of comfort built by law enforcement and media alike. Commentary poured in, revisiting dozens of cases involving black citizens unlawfully detained, beaten or killed, names no one remembered, no video, no credible witnesses, and certainly no identification codes strong enough to make the Pentagon respond within 10 minutes. A field reporter summed it up. Today, Ashton is known not for something noble, but for becoming a measuring stick for justice by rank. And the painful truth is, If the man detained hadn't been General Braxton, we might never have known this happened at all. On social media, the conversation shifted to that possibility. Images of Braxton, handcuffed, standing at the hood, picking up his badge, were shared beside photos of others. No rank, no security, no voice. Forgotten names were posted not to honor them, but to pose a question. Who doesn't get remembered simply because they weren't allowed to be heard? The story was no longer about one isolated injustice. It became a test of belief, whether justice is truly for all or only for those with titles high enough to turn wrongdoing into a scandal, rather than a footnote buried in an internal file. And that was when the people of Ashton understood what had happened couldn't be answered with an apology. They didn't need someone to admit fault. They needed one honest look into the question just raised, not to solve it, but to make sure it would never be ignored again. At exactly 8 a.m. on Monday, the Southern District Federal Court of Georgia officially opened a public trial against the two police officers involved in the arrest of General Nathaniel Braxton. This was no quiet internal proceeding or softened administrative inquiry. The indictment, nearly 50 pages long, listed the charges explicitly: organized abuse of authority, public humiliation of a senior federal officer, unlawful use of force, and interference with a classified military communications device tied to national security. Unlike trials broadcast only after public pressure, this case was live-streamed from the start, at the joint request of the Department of Defense and the Office of the Attorney General. The wide courtroom shots did more than document the visuals. They captured the full weight of a nation confronting a single question: if he hadn't been a general, would any of this still be considered illegal? The two defendants, Sergeant Oscar Dale and Officer Riley Moore, entered the courtroom in plain black suits, their faces stripped of the defiance seen in the early days of the case. Once praised as tactical and tough, today they looked simply exposed. Behind them stood not department crests, but behavioral reports. Dozens of video clips and recordings from military satellites, security cameras, and encrypted communication systems. The indictment opened with what the public already knew. They stopped Braxton not for his actions, but for how he looked. But the investigation revealed more. This was not a split-second decision. It was the product of a deliberate chain of bias, following Braxton's car for over 3 minutes before cutting him off, using threatening language without justification, and seizing a military phone despite warnings not to tamper with strategic equipment. The lead prosecutor, a Dominican-American woman, stood before the court and said firmly, this was not a lapse in judgment. It was a crime committed under the mask of a badge. And if today we call this inexperience, then tomorrow no one will be safe obeying the law. The audio recording played mid-trial, Braxton's voice stating, "This is Braxton, code Black Sierra 0. I need confirmation." The reply, "Where are you, sir?" sliced through the courtroom silence. It immediately established that this was not an impersonator, but a general engaged in strategic communication. From that moment on, every action by the officers ceased being a misstep and became an offense against a federal duty in progress. The 7-person jury, diverse in race and generation, didn't need long. The verdict was unanimous. The two officers hadn't acted in defense, nor under pressure, but from racial bias, triggered by skin color and silence. When the judge announced sentencing would follow in the next session, no one spoke. No outbursts, no interruptions. Everyone knew that session would mark more than the end of a case. It would seal the line after decades, where the system let such actions pass without being called what they truly were. Before leaving, the prosecutor looked directly at the defendants. Not with anger, not shouting, just one sentence. What you thought was power turned out to be the biggest trap you built for yourselves. Braxton remained absent. He had not appeared in court, but his face, through millions of live streams, was everywhere, not to demand justice for himself, but so that those who once believed they could abuse power would learn. This time, they wouldn't walk out with a warning. They entered this trial as who they truly were, and this time, it would be named and sentenced. After 2 weeks of intense proceedings with nearly 30 witnesses, 50 hours of footage, and hundreds of pages from both military and civilian sources, the Georgia federal court entered final sentencing. The courtroom was full, no empty seats. Outside, hundreds watched from large screens, waiting in heavy silence. The presiding judge, a white woman whose father had been a police officer, read the verdict without trembling. Every word hit hard. Looking straight at the defendants, Oscar Dale and Riley Moore, she said, "This court finds the defendants guilty of organized abuse of power, deliberate disrespect toward a senior military officer, unlawful use of force, and interference with national security equipment. These were not procedural missteps. They undermined the principles of law. As such, both defendants are dismissed and terminated for conduct damaging to the institution's credibility." The room remained silent. The verdict struck like glass breaking, clear and irreversible. Some cried, not from joy, but from the weight of knowing wrongful authority had finally been held to account. Others were stunned. For many, this was the first moment when justice stopped making room for confusion with mercy. On national television, a retired officer with over 30 years of service faced the camera and said, "I taught about honor in this profession, and I believe this is the fairest sentence. If we're not strict now, we're saying it's fine to let this happen again." To those with no rank, no cameras, and no one to believe them, public response split. Some welcomed it as the strongest message since the civil rights era. Others feared it would set a dangerous precedent. But one truth stood firm. For the first time in modern policing, a racially charged arrest was not just named, but fully judged and sentenced to its core. General Braxton did not attend. He stayed silent, as he had from the start. A military representative stood in for him and said, "He didn't come because this was never just about one man in handcuffs. It was about a society that grew too used to bowing to what was wrong. And today, someone finally bowed because of it." As the crowd left the courtroom, few spoke. But the mood had changed. In the red eyes, the quiet nods, the slowed steps, people understood. Justice doesn't come through outrage. It comes when a system stops protecting what the public conscience already knows is wrong. That was the real sentence. Not the end of 2 careers, but the beginning of something that can no longer be ignored. Right after the court sentenced the 2 officers involved in General Nathaniel Braxton's arrest to dismissal, a quiet stream of people began arriving at local legal offices. They didn't come seeking attention, compensation, or headlines. They came to do something many of them had never dared before: submit the truth they once had to swallow, now in the form of formal testimony. In less than a week, over 200 supporting witness statements were filed with the federal court, coming from across the country. From Georgia to Mississippi, from Florida up to Missouri. Most of the submissions were from black men, but also included women, minors at the time of their detention, and individuals still carrying psychological scars. Among them was Marcus Hill, now 52, who had been stopped by police at age 18 while driving home from a late shift. No warrant, no report, just the same question repeated for hours. "Where'd you steal the car from?" In his statement, he wrote, "I didn't die, but I lived in fear for 20 years. Every time I heard a siren, even when I did nothing wrong, my heart raced like I was about to be taken." No one had ever called those incidents crimes. They were labeled mistargeted checks, communication errors, or overuse of protocol. But when Braxton's video spread, the names, once buried, began surfacing, not as statistics, but as living proof of a justice system that once chose who deserved protection. The U.S. Attorney's Office was unprepared for the volume of incoming reports. An internal memo stated, "Many wrongful detentions were never logged in any system, not due to oversight, but by design. Those records are now being attached to the Braxton case, not to add charges, but to form a collective body of evidence showing that the 2 officers did not act in isolation, but as part of a long-standing racial bias network." The pressure did not stop at the legal level. In Washington, D.C., a special congressional committee was convened urgently. Lawmakers, usually debating budgets or border security, now sat through victim testimony. interspersed with real footage. One video showed a 12-year-old boy ordered to lie face down on the concrete outside his home for playing with a toy drone that resembled surveillance equipment. The hearing paused after a pointed question from an Asian American senator. Who writes the training curriculum for these officers? Why is the first lesson, 15 minutes after raising the flag, about identifying suspects based on their eyes, voice, or walk? A former police chief, brought in as an expert witness, offered no defense. Instead, he opened with an admission. We used to tell rookies, if you don't feel danger, you're doing it wrong. But we never taught them to ask, where does that danger come from? From the behavior or from the bias planted in their heads long before they ever put on a badge? A federal investigation confirmed that most police academies lacked proper training on implicit bias or systemic racism, allowing looking suspicious to justify action without legal or moral scrutiny. Headlines echoed nationwide. Braxton wasn't given special treatment. His case forced the system to face what it had long ignored. Outside the hearing, an elderly black woman held a black and white photo of her brother, who was beaten in 1967 for not showing ID. When asked how she felt, she said softly, "I don't expect justice to rewind time. But at least now, it's not allowed to look away." 2 days later, a petition titled "Reopen the Records, Return the Truth" was launched online. Within 1 hour, it gained over 80,000 signatures. By the end of the first day, over 300,000. Within 48 hours, it crossed 1 million. The demands were simple. Review all unprosecuted detentions from the past 5 years, and make public any case lacking a legal basis. The petition came not from politicians, but from final-year law students. Every blank report, they wrote, is a moral void. We don't ask to undo the past. We ask to stop repeating it. At first, authorities hesitated. Some departments claimed they lacked staff to review thousands of cases. But the pressure spread. Major news outlets opened public archives of unexplained detentions, cases with no rank, no footage, no voice. That visibility made the petition impossible to ignore. The Department of Justice responded. Starting next month, a federal review will audit all civil detentions with no prosecution. Non-compliant departments will lose special funding. A technical note, but one that forced action. Meanwhile, the National Police Academy, facing its biggest crisis, received a formal request from senior cadets to overhaul field training. We were taught to spot intent from posture and gaze, they wrote, but never taught to question if that gaze carried bias. The academy convened within 36 hours and announced new standards: mandatory racial diversity in training scenarios, a ban on judging threat by appearance, and a required course titled The Braxton Scenario, When Silence Isn't Safety. It wasn't an apology. It was an overdue admission. The system had trained officers to act on instinct, not awareness. That training now had to be rewritten, not for optics, but to ensure the next handcuffed person has a chance to be seen with dignity from the start. One line from the new curriculum was shared widely. The Braxton case isn't an exception. It's what should have always been the standard. His name left courtrooms, entered textbooks, and took root in the minds of a new generation of officers, those who now know justice starts not with suspicion of others, but with questioning the lens through which they're seen. Just as the Braxton case seemed closed legally, a new wave of backlash emerged, not from extremists or tabloids, but from within the military. A right-wing military blog known for mocking political correctness published a story that quickly gained hundreds of thousands of shares. Citing an anonymous source in the Department of Defense, the article claimed the Braxton incident was a staged campaign to pressure police recruitment policy. No author was named, but all signs pointed to one man, Colonel Mason Wilcox. Wilcox, once a training regiment commander in Texas, had been suspended by General Braxton 3 years earlier for budget misallocation and concealing internal abuse. Though he wasn't demoted, Wilcox lost all promotion prospects and was reassigned to an administrative desk at the Pentagon, a silent burial of reputation in military terms. His false claims weren't shocking for their content, but for their timing. The Post dropped just as police academies debated new standards and Congress prepared to vote on a bill to regulate unlawful arrests. Titled General or Actor, the piece reignited conservative skepticism about the case. In an era where lies travel faster than facts, the Pentagon knew silence was no longer an option. One day later, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff held a rare press conference. General Margaret Yoon, a four-star officer, addressed the media without a written statement. She spoke plainly and firmly. "We are sworn to protect justice with both action and truth. And when someone uses military affiliation to distort truth for personal gain, we respond with exactly what they hope to discredit: verifiable data." Immediately after, the Department of Defense released a complete tactical audio record from Braxton's encrypted phone, including identity verification logs from emergency response units and internal audio from the Armored Vehicle Deployment Command. The records confirmed Braxton followed all emergency communication protocols, and that the military was unaware he had been detained until after the code Black Sierra 0 was authenticated. The data included time-stamped communication chains, device logs, and strategic response timelines. A specific directive from Andrews Base stood out. General Braxton is being unlawfully restrained. Activate priority-level federal response. Objective: ensure safety and restore command authority. The moment this aired, remaining doubts collapsed. The blog was ordered to remove the article, and Colonel Wilcox was summoned for an internal investigation on charges of misusing authority to spread disinformation affecting institutional security. This time, there was no quiet reassignment. Wilcox was fully suspended and now faces military court. The military made no further statements after the press conference, but one line from the press release echoed across national media. "When truth has evidence, it needs no explanation, and when someone stays silent in the face of wrong, they owe no defense. It's the system that must speak." The shadow of slander vanished under a truth backed not by opinion, but by the very structure of power those who lied thought they could exploit. This time it was not the media or courts, but the military that spoke with finality. General Braxton staged nothing. The truth was documented from the first second. After the release of Braxton's tactical recordings and federal response data, conspiracy theories collapsed. Posts claiming staged drama or planned incident were drowned by public reaction. Thousands of comments made one point: no one chooses to be humiliated for attention. One person asked, "If you wanted to be on national TV, would you pick being handcuffed in public or just show up with your resume?" Another said, "If this were theater, who volunteered to be degraded?" Viewers returned to the video, this time not to dissect, but to feel it. A calm, unresisting man stood in silence as insults were thrown, revealed later to be a three-star general. His refusal to assert power became the most powerful statement. The hashtags once pushing conspiracies were flagged for misinformation, while new ones, Black Sierra 0 and Braxton did ask to lead, rose as calls for justice based not on who's right, but who has been wronged most deeply. As debate faded, people faced a harder truth. This was no longer about Braxton. His medals stopped mattering. The real question became, if he were just another black man, would anyone be held accountable? The uncomfortable answer, probably not. No video, no court, no recognition. And that, not his title, was why justice arrived, not because of who he was, but because of what others assumed he was not worth. The true crime wasn't the arrest, it was the belief that some people aren't worth protecting, that some faces don't need checking because they look wrong. When the officers were sentenced to death, the message wasn't revenge, it was correction. Bias ordered into action is a crime. Outside the Georgia courthouse, someone posted a plain paper with one handwritten line. Justice doesn't begin with who's right, it begins with who gets seen as human. And this time, that truth couldn't be unseen. The shock from the Braxton case did not end in Georgia. When the death sentence was announced, when Defense Department documents were released, and conspiracy theories collapsed under irrefutable tactical data, something cracked in the national psyche. For the first time in modern history, A case of police abuse was not only exposed, but also pursued to the end. And from that gap emerged a new question, not whether it happened, but how many times it had happened without anyone knowing, recording, or remembering. California was the first to respond. The state's attorney general announced the creation of a historical law enforcement violence review board to re-examine all deaths in police custody before the year 2000, especially those closed without independent review. Within a week, Illinois, Massachusetts, and Oregon followed with similar declarations. By the end of the month, at least 11 states committed to reopening suspicious cases involving racial bias. In dusty archives, handwritten reports, and faded faxes were brought to light. Law students, sociologists, and independent auditors were called in, not to change old conclusions, but to ask the questions the system had long avoided. In Ohio, a Haitian-American legal director of the Civil Archive Project spoke plainly at a press conference. Braxton lived, but without the clip, he could have been another forgotten name. We're not waiting for the next death. That list is already too long to keep calling it an error. His words silenced many, not by blaming individuals, but by calling out a system that had normalized death under vague phrases like non-compliance, erratic behavior, or appeared threatening. National television aired a map titled Cases Reopened After Braxton. Red dots appeared across the country, each representing a death once shelved under unavoidable cause. Some victims had been buried quickly, with police as the only source of information. Now families were learning, for the first time, what happened. In Alabama, a 70-year-old mother wept as she recalled her son. I believed he resisted. That's what they told me. But now, I know. He never got to reach for his wallet. I don't need anyone to go to jail. I just need to know his silence wasn't guilt, it was forced. Reopening the files wasn't just legal. It was exhumation, not of remains, but of a distorted history. In every restored audio, every falsified report, every disproven statement, a generation was taught that silence was the cost of survival. But now, things had changed. Braxton didn't have to die to change the system. He only had to not retaliate, not flash credentials, not raise his voice, and let the truth run its course. The way he stood still created a gap too large for the system to cover. And in that silence, people finally looked back, not in regret, but to rewrite files once closed too quickly, with the questions no one had dared to ask. Who was believed without evidence? Who was convicted without counsel? Who disappeared because their death wasn't big enough to make headlines? This time, someone lived to remind the system, truth does not come from rank, but from how we act when the silenced have no one else to defend them. As states reopened cases involving police deaths, attention shifted from forgotten files to departments once praised as reform models. Agencies celebrated with Justice Department awards and training programs were now under fire, not for violating the law, but for concealing how they had broken it. In Minnesota, a report revealed Rosefield police had dismissed over 134 complaints in 8 years, half involving unjustified searches and bias against young black men. These complaints weren't listed in disciplinary files. They were renamed as training reports to avoid scrutiny. A journalist who once covered Rosefield said, "We thought justice could be trained, but people still find ways to rename what they don't want to see." Other departments in Colorado, Kentucky, and Illinois soon faced probes for similar complaint filtering tactics, exposing an administrative layer designed to keep the truth out. After headlines like "Model or Mask," officials were forced to respond. Denver's police chief, once hailed for de-escalation programs, admitted on TV, "If the harmed have no voice, then softening conflict only comforts the offender." A coalition then released a report titled, "We Knew and Did Nothing," compiling directives from over 30 departments showing how image was prioritized over accountability. One image from the report went viral. A precinct's honor wall, lined with awards but missing space for the complaint of a young man who died in custody after a wrongful arrest. A handwritten note below read, Justice doesn't need more dead, it needs the living to stop looking away. This time, that message didn't stay on the signs. It entered training manuals, internal briefings, and became a phrase young officers now repeat to one another, not as orders, but as a warning. Look closely, act rightly, and do not look away again. 1 month after the historic trial that convicted the 2 officers who arrested General Nathaniel Braxton, the United States Congress held an emergency hearing on one of the most controversial legal foundations in law enforcement, the reasonable suspicion doctrine. Once seen as a tool to protect officers in volatile situations, it was now under scrutiny as a root cause of abuse of power, racial bias, and street-level overreach. Held at the Cannon House office building, the hearing drew nearly every member of the House Judiciary Committee, along with representatives from key federal agencies. The atmosphere felt more like a wartime tribunal than a bipartisan formality. This time, they came not to perform, but to confront what America had long treated as an untouchable cornerstone. Representative Julian Harris of Maryland opened with a tone that barely masked his accumulated frustration. "We allowed reasonable suspicion to become an unchecked license," he said. "It began as a safeguard for high-pressure responses, but now we've turned suspicion into immunity." His words targeted not individuals, but an entire legal framework that had shielded countless unverified actions. For over 30 years, thousands of stops, searches, and pursuits had been justified with no evidence, just a gut feeling. That gut was now on trial, in a country that could no longer afford its mistakes. Among the witnesses sat a tall, silver-haired man in a plain gray suit. He represented no organization and was hardly a media fixture, but the room fell silent when he introduced himself. Edward Marks, retired police chief, State of Nevada. Once commander of over 2,000 officers and honored at the White House for urban patrol reform, he came not to defend the system, but to fulfill what he called a final duty before leaving the profession. "I taught young officers how to read suspicious eyes," he said slowly. "Body language, tone, blinking patterns, but I never taught them how to read a person." He paused. "And I never asked, if the suspicion in their eyes mirrors their own bias, can it be trusted? Or is it just a way to justify discomfort with a skin tone, a hoodie, a face they don't recognize?" No one replied, because he had said what many had long avoided, that unchecked suspicion is the most corruptible form of power. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Over 20 voices were heard, from civil rights attorneys to criminologists, from past victims to community leaders. A 700-page report listed over 3,000 cases of people detained for looking suspicious with no resulting criminal charges. The committee chair closed the session by announcing a draft bill to amend the doctrine. Every stop must be based on clearly articulable grounds, subject to documentation, oversight, and legal challenge. It also proposed creating a body to audit implicit bias in patrol decisions, with access to full behavioral histories of field officers. On national television, the anchor commented, "Braxton didn't show up here, but he forced Congress to lay its hands for the first time on a doctrine once seen as untouchable. And when a single question can challenge the legal definition of suspicion, that is no longer a personal victory. It is how a society relearns to look at itself. And this time, that gaze no longer hides behind suspicion. It demands understanding and courage." 2 weeks after the historic hearing on the reasonable suspicion doctrine, Time released a special issue. The cover, a muted steel gray, bore only one image: General Nathaniel Braxton, handcuffed, standing upright under the midday sun, half his face in shadow, silent, unbowed. The feature, written by a war correspondent known for reporting in Ukraine, Syria, and domestic uprisings, began, "We once believed historic photos needed motion. Raised fists, tears, explosions, blood. This time, one man did nothing and moved the entire system." The article didn't retell the story. Everyone already knew it. Instead, it unpacked the uncomfortable truth. that someone like Braxton, with rank, reputation, and ties at the highest levels, could still be reduced to a suspect in seconds, simply because his skin resembled what others were trained to see as a threat. The author called it systematized misinstinct, a century of reform still failing to erase responses born of fear, not empathy. The photos spread globally, absent any tribute or iconography. It didn't turn Braxton into a hero. It made millions stop and face something long normalized, but never truly named. The silence of the accused is not admission. It is sometimes the only way to survive. As people searched for why this story didn't fade like others, a phrase began circulating among sociologists and journalists: the Braxton effect. It wasn't an event, a slogan, or a symbol of protest. It was defined simply as this: when someone stands still, unflinching, unapologetic, unafraid, and that silence alone forces the system to pause and check itself. Universities began including the term in policy ethics syllabi. Law students analyzed Braxton not through criminal law but through moral justice. At a police academy in New Jersey, the Braxton effect became a scenario drill. How do officers respond when faced with a person doing nothing? And are they clear-headed enough not to treat silence as defiant? When asked if the term was too poetic for a tragic incident, the federal attorney general replied, "It used to take blood to change this country. This time, someone alive did it. If that's what you call an effect, I hope it never ends." From a single image, a new language of justice began to form. Not dramatic, not glorified, just one thing: when a person keeps their dignity amid wrongdoing, the system can no longer pretend it didn't see. When the photo of General Braxton in handcuffs appeared on the cover of Time, and the phrase "the Braxton effect" began circulating through training systems, the impact of the story extended far beyond the media. It became the final push that forced the federal Congress to turn public sentiment into policy. As an immediate response, a new bill was formally introduced in the House of Representatives under the provisional title, the National Enforcement Integrity Act. The core of the bill is a single line, but one powerful enough to reshape the entire legal framework of American law enforcement. Any officer who detains, searches, restrains, or holds a citizen without clear legal grounds based on racial bias may face criminal prosecution, not be treated as an administrative error. For the first time since the 1970s, a practice long considered a procedural mistake would be categorized as a federal offense, with penalties including prison time, permanent removal from service, and a ban from holding any supervisory position within enforcement agencies. Many objections were raised, suggesting the law would hinder officer response in dangerous situations. But Representative Cassie Flores, one of the bill's sponsors, countered during debate. "We are not asking officers to step back from danger. We are asking them to be accountable for bias. If they cannot distinguish between reacting to a threat and reacting to a prejudice, then they should not be granted authority in the first place." In another hall at the National Police Academy in Quantico, Virginia, a symbolic change was officially added to the curriculum. On a dark blue announcement board at the entrance to the main lecture hall, a new line had just been posted. New module: Ethical Decision-Making, the Braxton Scenario. The lesson was not theoretical. Trainees were placed into real-world simulations in which they faced a citizen who did not react, did not threaten, and showed no abnormal behavior, but belonged to a racial group commonly profiled as a risk. There were no right answers, no technical scores, only one question posed after each scenario. If this person weren't someone famous, would you have acted differently? A professor at the academy shared in a local news interview, "We cannot erase bias with a single lesson, but we can require every future officer to stand before a mirror, examine their instincts, and ask, is my reaction based on knowledge or on fear that has never been challenged?" Police academies in New York, Seattle, Denver, and Houston each introduced a revised version of the same training module, under different names but with a shared ethical foundation. Justice cannot be the product of instinct, if that instinct has been shaped by societal bias. From Capitol Hill to tactical classrooms, Braxton's name is no longer a symbol, it is now a case study. One man standing still in the street is no longer just a moment of restraint, it is now a permanent entry in training manuals nationwide, teaching that justice begins not with power, but with pause. In simulation drills, recruits now confront scenarios without shouting or resistance, just the quiet presence of someone doing nothing threatening. They are not graded on procedures or reaction time, but asked one question. If no one is watching, do you trust yourself to act without prejudice? Beyond law enforcement, the story reached public schools. In Ohio, an 11th grade student named Elijah Monroe wrote an essay responding to the prompt, "A moment that changed how I think about right and wrong." He wrote, "He didn't yell, he didn't demand, he just stood there, eyes steady, hands cuffed. And if one man said nothing and the country listened, who teaches me when silence is the right thing to do?" The essay was shared across educator forums and published in full in the Atlantic's Youth and Citizenship section. At West Point, Braxton's story was added to the ethics and crisis decision-making curriculum. It was not framed as heroism, but as a question of moral leadership. Cadets studied how he used neither his title nor his voice, and were asked, if you saw a man being arrested without resistance, would his silence make you uncomfortable or make you question your assumptions? Their final assignment was to rewrite the moment, not from the officer's view, but from the bystanders. They had to define what changed not through action, but through inaction. The new textbook chapter isn't titled The Braxton Case. It reads, "When one person stands still and a nation can no longer look away." At the end of every chapter, one question remains, in italics, was his silence a sign of guilt or a truth we never learned to hear? The silence of General Braxton did more than shift how society viewed police conduct. It forced the entire law enforcement community to confront something it had long avoided, internal compromise. In the weeks following the nationwide adoption of the ethical situational assessment training across police academies and military institutions, an unexpected trend emerged. A wave of senior officers began submitting early resignation letters, stepping down before their official retirement dates. They made no grand announcements, held no press conferences, and cited no personal or health reasons. But in each resignation letter sent to their superiors, one recurring line appeared. "I once believed I was maintaining order. In truth, I was preserving silence more often than I was defending justice." In Arizona, the deputy director of the Phoenix Police Department, once honored for his role in the Community Policing Engage program, was the first to quietly leave, releasing an internal letter with permission afterward. In it, he wrote, "I used to tell young officers to stay quiet when they saw misconduct without clear proof. I said, don't disrupt the formation for something unclear. But now I understand. Waiting was exactly what let wrong become an unspoken rule." In Denver, a rapid response team captain resigned just 6 months before receiving his veteran commendation. His reason was brief. "If I stay, I will have to answer questions I can no longer avoid." No one forced them out, but the story of Braxton had made an entire generation within the system begin to re-examine not just their actions, but the gap between what they once believed and what they chose not to face. At the same time, a different wave began to rise, not from those stepping away, but from those once directly trained by Braxton during his years as Director of Personnel Strategy in the Army. They did not speak often, but at professional conferences and officer training sessions they began to stand up, not to recount his accolades, but to share what he taught that was never written into curricula. Lieutenant Colonel Joanne Kim, now director of a peacekeeping initiative in the Middle East, spoke at an international military forum. "I trained under him. I don't remember how he taught formation tactics or artillery calls, everyone teaches that, but I will never forget the day he said, 'In uncertain situations, do not shoot. You do not have the right to kill what you do not understand.'" That statement echoed among former cadets, not because it was novel, but because it directly opposed what they had heard elsewhere. React first, explain later. Braxton never taught weakness. He taught threshold control, the ability to understand where force ends and humanity must begin. At a memorial service for victims of racial profiling, a young Iraq War veteran addressed a packed audience. "I used to think I was a good soldier because I knew when to act, but thanks to him, I learned a true soldier is someone who knows when not to react. Then what you see isn't yet enough to judge." The impact spread. Military strategy training centers began requesting a new module titled Decision-Making Under Information Ambiguity, built by Braxton's former students. It did not focus on weapons. It taught a mindset, awareness. The idea is that the more power a person holds, the more precise and ethical their decisions must be, especially when confronting someone who cannot fight back. In classrooms, conferences, and training manuals, one message keeps returning, not as legend, but as a reminder. He didn't teach me how to fight. He taught me not to destroy what I hadn't tried to understand. That lesson, more than any tactic or command, is what prompted a generation to relearn how to use power, not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. As justice reform spread across states, the question once avoided began resurfacing everywhere. Why are children of color taught how to survive instead of how to live fully? At a national justice seminar, a researcher presented findings titled Training Before Adolescence, when children of color learn not to be suspected. In high minority areas, kids as young as 8 were being taught how not to look at police, how to keep their hands visible, how to say sir and ma'am before being spoken to. A federal reform director responded, "We can't keep teaching kids how not to be threats while failing to teach adults how to stop seeing them that way." Soon after, updated police training manuals included a new section, Perception Checks When Approaching Youth, Especially Youth of Color. Its first line wasn't a rule, but a quote. "Don't teach them how not to be suspected. Teach adults to stop suspecting." The line spread fast onto posters, parent workshops, and social media. When asked, "If we drop suspicion, how do we stay safe?" practitioners answered, "Safety comes from judging behavior, not skin color." In a North Carolina classroom, students were asked to write about someone who changed a system just by doing what was right. Many named Braxton. Not General Braxton, just Braxton. One wrote, "If he had shouted, he might have died. If he'd shown a badge, maybe he'd have been spared but forgotten. He stood still, so the whole country had to stop. It wasn't power that made people remember him, it was restraint. At the moment, it mattered most." And that's why his name doesn't appear in parades or on plaques. But it's spoken in training rooms, classrooms, and around kitchen tables, where families once taught survival and are now asking a better question: if he could stand still and be heard, why are we still teaching our kids to live like they're wrong before they even speak? As the story of Braxton made its way from military lecture halls to policy reform manuals, people began to expect what usually follows a major public reckoning: a formal statement, a nationwide interview, or at the very least a memoir to bring everything to a close. But General Nathaniel Braxton did none of those things. He declined all television invitations. He refused every medal. He did not attend any ceremonies hosted by the government. And when a major publishing house offered a 6-figure advance for his autobiography, he replied with just one sentence through his representative: "I've already spoken through my silence." No one saw him in headlines again. There were no behind-the-scenes clips, no social media posts, but one late autumn day, at the main hall of the National Civil Rights Justice Museum, the curator received a plain package with no return address, only the name, N. Braxton. Inside was an old silver military badge, visibly scratched along the right edge, a shallow crack he had once bent down to pick up after being uncuffed. Alongside the badge was a small card, handwritten in black ink, the penmanship plain but steady. No date, no heading, just one line: "I don't need to be remembered as the right one. I only ask to be remembered as the one who didn't look away." The museum's board quickly decided to dedicate a space solely to the item. It wasn't placed next to the medals. It wasn't grouped with portraits of great commanders. They mounted it beside a blank white wall. No name, no image, just the silver badge inside a glass box. Beneath it, they printed only the words from the card. In the early days, many visitors stopped by out of curiosity. They looked for an interactive screen, a narrated video, and an audio guide, but the silence, undisturbed and absolute, made them stay longer. A fifth-grade girl visiting with her mother stared at the badge and whispered, "It's so old." Her mother gently replied, "It's old because it's been through what most people choose not to see." Since then, more and more visitors stopped by each week, not to take photos, but to stand quietly before the badge. People began leaving folded notes by the glass, even though there was no designated box, and enough that staff began collecting them each morning. Written in many languages, the messages came from those who had once stayed silent, who had been doubted, or who had witnessed injustice but never dared to speak. The badge, once merely a symbol of rank, had become something else entirely. A physical reminder that doing the right thing doesn't need to come from shouting or be etched in stone. It needs to be held, intact, in the resolve of one person at the very moment when everyone else chooses to lower their heads. And Braxton, through his quiet withdrawal, left a space no title could fill, yet full enough to let a generation rise and write what he never spoke. One late afternoon, as the museum prepared to close, a young intern from the Justice and Criminal Reform Program stopped by the exhibit he'd quietly avoided for weeks. A final-year law student from New Jersey, he was part of the fall program to study the history of law enforcement and the role of citizenship in public systems. But that day, for the first time, he stood before the glass case where Braxton's silver badge lay, set apart, without captions, no spotlight, no narrated story. The badge wasn't large, nor polished. The scratches along its right edge remained. Its back was faint, as if marked by moisture or sweat or time. Nothing had changed since it was sent in, by design. No polishing, no restoration, no revival of glory, only the preservation of truth. He stood there for a long moment. No one noticed. Footsteps echoed from the end of the hall as a guard signaled closing time. But in that moment, he lowered his head, hand loosely clutching a still unopened notebook, and said softly, as if only to himself, "If he stayed silent so I could speak, then I'd better learn to use that voice well." No one recorded those words, but a security camera captured him walking out of the exhibit, slower than usual. That night, he sent in a request to change his thesis topic from defensive thinking in law enforcement to ethical silence, from Braxton to the responsibility of a new civic generation. The badge still rests in the same place. No nameplate, no QR description. The museum staff believed that explaining too much would dilute its meaning. They kept it as it arrived, a testament of quiet resolve that didn't need media framing. Hundreds pass by daily, some glance, some pause. A few ask the front desk why it stands alone, but no one is allowed to touch it. No one wipes its scratches, and over time, no one tries to, because those marks are the story. They are the imperfection, unhidden, unpolished, of a moment when a man held his dignity, not with authority, but with the choice not to turn away. No plaque reads, "Legacy of Braxton," because that legacy is now in the way one young person leaves the museum and starts questioning silence, voice, and what gives a person the courage not to retaliate but to leave behind a scar as a lesson that needs no rewriting. Because sometimes what lasts longest isn't triumph, it's the thing that once hurt and was kept exactly as it was, so no one forgets it was the first sign of waking up. On a Monday morning at a public elementary school in the suburbs of Atlanta, after the class had just finished watching a short documentary clip about the Braxton General incident, part of a newly implemented civics education program. A girl, around 8 years old, with curly hair and light brown skin, sat still for a while in front of the darkened screen. She turned to her father, who was visiting as a classroom guest that day, and asked in a calm but weighty voice, "Why did they arrest him if he's a general?" The father, a tax audit officer, was not a soldier, not an activist, and had never spoken publicly about justice or discrimination. He was simply a dad attending a special lesson with his child. But that question cut through his neatly pressed shirt like a blade. He was at a loss for words, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he knew that any explanation would teach his daughter something painful. There was a long silence. Then, as if reading what no one dared say aloud, the teacher, white woman in her 40s, standing by the board, turned, picked up a piece of white chalk, and wrote 3 lines, slowly and clearly. Sometimes people don't see the rank. They see the color of the skin first, and they act on what they've learned to do, not on what's right. The classroom fell quiet. No one nodded. No one objected, but something dropped, like a veil once covering awareness. The students, their faces still soft and young, began to understand. What they had just watched was not merely something that happened once, but part of how society once looked and chose to believe, based on things that should never have been the measure. The father, after a moment of disorientation, placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder and gave a light squeeze. He didn't say, "Don't worry," nor did he say, "That's all in the past." He only whispered, "Thank you for asking." And in those words were all the gratitude and sorrow of someone who had long carried a familiar feeling, having to walk softly, speak gently, live carefully, even when he had done nothing wrong. After that class, the teacher decided not to continue with the usual lesson. Instead, she invited the students to write a short response. If you had witnessed the incident that day, what would you have done? No 2 answers were the same, but nearly 1/3 of the students wrote that they would not stay silent. One boy wrote, "I would record it on video." Another wrote, "I would yell, 'He didn't do anything!' really loud." The teacher collected the papers, didn't grade them. She chose just one passage, printed it large, and posted it on the back wall of the classroom. In that passage, a student had written, in still unsteady handwriting, "I think if someone gets arrested and nobody asks why, then I don't want to be the person just watching. Because what if next time it's someone I love?" And that's how children began to understand justice, not through punishment, not through speeches, but through a man standing silently, and a system that once taught to see him as a threat, not as a human being. And in that innocent question, why did they arrest him if he's a general, lies what generations of silence are now beginning to relearn. Rank doesn't always protect, but truth, if kept alive, will teach the next generation to look harder and to believe less in the old, sanctioned reflexes that were never right. Glen Haven, Georgia, less than 20 miles from where General Braxton was arrested, was a quiet town lined with old elm trees and a central park named after a Civil War general known for crushing a rebellion in 1863. For over a century, the park hosted festivals and family picnics. Few remembered who the general was or why he mattered until a group of high school students petitioned to rename the park to reflect the truth, not one-sided history. The town council hesitated, wary of appearing trendy, but a 12th grader, son of a former police officer, stood before a packed room holding a photo of Braxton in cuffs and said, "History isn't just for pride, it's for knowing where we went wrong. If no one here ever cuffed the wrong person, we're lucky. But if someone did, we should remember the man who stood still, so we'd learn to look again." 3 weeks later, the park was renamed Black Sierra Park, after Braxton's call sign, Black Sierra 0. A statue was raised. Not a likeness, just a man standing, hands folded, in a plain shirt. No rank, no medals. On the basis, here someone was handcuffed for the wrong reason. Each April, senior students gather at the statue. No speeches, just one silent minute. That minute isn't for mourning, but to learn the weight of silence before speaking truth. No teacher orders it. No parent enforces it, but year after year, teenagers stand before that faceless figure and wonder, if it were me, would I stay whole without shouting? One girl wrote in the yearbook, "I thought resistance meant yelling. Now I know, sometimes standing still is how you push back against what's wrong, quietly." So Braxton's name lives on, not in bronze, but in the moment a young person stands still and asks, "Do we see a person or just what we've been taught to fear?" At a newly established training center in Illinois, once known as a national model for law enforcement behavior, a special program has officially launched across the country, the Detainee Experience Course, designed for newly graduated officers and those transitioning from reserves to field duty. Unlike traditional training focused on tactical control, this program begins not with theory, but with emotion. Each trainee is placed into a simulation room, where they become a suspect in a scenario with no prior explanation. No briefing is given, no instructions offered. They are simply told to act as a regular citizen in an unexpected situation. Bright lights, simulated sirens. A door bursts open with a shout, "Freeze! Hands up! What are you doing here?" One trainee, this time Sergeant Zachary Owens, 27 years old, formerly of Baltimore's inner-city patrol unit, is placed in the scenario. He wears civilian clothes, carries no weapon, and receives only one instruction: react as yourself if you had done nothing wrong. 5 minutes later, when the simulation ends, Owens exits the room, pale-faced. He tries to stay composed, but when the instructor asks how he feels, he doesn't respond immediately. Minutes later, in front of the class, he breaks down. His voice cracks, harsh and dry. "All my life I've been trained to manage danger. I thought I was strong. I thought I had control. But 5 minutes of being doubted, questioned, held without knowing why, I no longer knew who I was. I get it now. The first thing you lose isn't a right. It's the sense that you even legally belong where you are." No one laughs. No one pats him on the back. Everyone understands that kind of realization is rare and the most valuable part of any training. The program doesn't end with one simulation. Trainees go through further scenarios, being interrogated in front of loved ones, having their phones taken, being denied an explanation for detention. After each, they must write a personal journal, not graded, not submitted, but required for their training file. The content doesn't matter. What matters is that they are forced to confront their instincts when stripped of the role of the one in power. The training center also used internal monitoring tools, heart rate, voice tremor, and involuntary movements to measure stress. After 6 months, results showed that over 80% of trainees crossed psychological stress thresholds within 5 minutes, mirroring the levels of real interrogation. This wasn't to blame anyone, it was to teach a point. If 5 minutes can shake someone's sense of self, then doing that to real people isn't a tactic, it's harm, made systematic. At the first program's closing, the director didn't list accomplishments. He told a story. The first time he saw someone detained in the street, clearly lost. "I used to think reacting fast was what made a pro. Now I know. It's sensing the damage you might cause before you cause it that makes the difference." Soon, academies across the country adopted the program, not from pressure, but because those who went through it understood. The cost of wrongful suspicion isn't in the rules, it's in how it wears down dignity, something no manual can teach. In nearly every final reflection, one line came up again and again. "I've learned that someone's silence isn't defiance. It might be the last thing they have to protect themselves." That fall, as schools added his name to their lessons, Nathaniel Braxton said nothing. No speeches, no memoirs, no interviews, even as his story was told everywhere. As the final speaker finished, and the ceremony seemed ready to end with a symbolic honor, he suddenly stood up. No one introduced him, no microphone was cut, no cue was given, just silence, the kind that clears space for what everyone had waited nearly a year to hear. He didn't walk to the stage or the podium. He stood where he was, arms by his side, eyes fixed ahead as if looking through every layer of the room. Then he spoke, not loudly, not softly, but with each word like a nail into wood. I am still alive. But justice only matters if next time, the one in handcuffs doesn't need to call anyone. No one clapped, no one reached for a camera, because they all knew. These words were not for headlines, not for reports, not for slogans. They were said to close the moment and remind everyone that his presence wasn't proof of justice, but proof of what never should have happened. A young policy advisor, part of drafting the Law Enforcement Integrity Bill, wrote in his notebook afterward, "I used to think the system needed a symbol, but he didn't stand up to be one. He stood up to remind us, if someone still needs to call for help to prove their innocence, then nothing has changed." The next morning, no news outlet ran a headline. No footage surfaced, but his words spread through internal emails, shared forums among officers, and a professor's handwritten note in a new training manual. The Braxton scenario. Justice only matters when the accused doesn't have to prove anything. That line, plain and without explanation, began to appear in law enforcement classes at the end of situational judgment exams. It was no longer a quote from a man once silent. It became an ethical benchmark. If you need to know who someone is to treat them right, you're not ready to wear the badge. And from then on, his words, spoken calmly, were repeated not as a motto, but as a system's final test for itself. I am still alive, but justice only matters if next time, the one in handcuffs doesn't need to call anyone. There was no national tribute, no Nathaniel Braxton Day in American history, no avenue bearing his name cutting through major cities. From the beginning, he never sought recognition, nor agreed to turning a systemic failure into a foundation for personal glorification. But in the small town where it all began, where his car was stopped on an empty street under the gaze of those wearing badges without awareness, a quiet change appeared. It wasn't on the news. There was no ribbon cutting, no officials speaking. One winter morning, people passing the intersection, the one where authority once overreached, saw a new plaque fixed to a fence by the street lamp, tilted slightly where the soil was still loose. The plaque was bronze-coated steel, no larger than a hand, no decoration. Just one laser-etched line, clean and plain. This is where justice was once broken and restored by someone who didn't need to shout. The person who placed it left no name, but later the town government confirmed they would not remove it. The mayor told the local paper simply, "Sometimes what lasts longest is what never needed ceremony." The plaque soon became a quiet destination, not for photos, but for reflection. An older man, once a local officer, stopped there one still afternoon. He didn't stay long, just placed a hand on the words for a few seconds, then walked on. Weeks later, his name appeared on a petition calling for reform in county leadership. A few weeks after that, a high school class visited the site, not to reenact, not to explain, but to stand silently where the system once slipped under its own weight. One student stayed behind longer than the rest. When asked what she thought, she said, "If justice broke here once, then I think everyone who passes by must make sure it doesn't break again." No annual memorial is held, no flowers, no candles, no anthem, no lights. But the plaque remains unmoved. Grass grows around it, sometimes trimmed. On the coldest winter mornings, frost clings to its surface, but the words stay clear as they were the day it was set. Not everyone understands the line at first read. Someone who didn't need to shout isn't about weakness or surrender. It speaks to something deeper, that some truths do not need to be shouted to exist. They endure because the person who held them was calm enough to keep them from turning into rage and instead let them become clarity. Hundreds of statues across America have risen, then fallen. Titles have been erased, street names replaced when darker truths came to light. But that small plaque, without glory, without image, not raised above eye level, became an anchor, a place where memory does not carry bitterness, but refuses to forget. Every time someone paused at that spot, no explanation, no speech, just standing there looking down, justice was reconnected again, not by ruling, but by the quiet awareness that this place had once marked a boundary, and someone chose not to let silence erase it. The first morning of the police training course for recent high school graduates began like any other: roll call, handouts, briefings on fitness, ethics, and scenario drills. But this year, there was one change. Before entering the training facility, all recruits were asked to stop at a nearby site just a few hundred meters from the intersection where General Braxton had once been detained. They arrived in silence. No instructions were given, only one person led, a veteran officer, now head of inner training and ethics awareness, guiding them to the small bronze plaque tucked beneath a tree along a low fence. The last in line, Malik Jordan, 18 years old, born and raised in the city's poor East Side, was the one who lingered longest. He didn't read aloud. He just stood and looked quietly at the inscription. This is where justice was once broken and restored by someone who didn't need to shout. A light wind passed, carrying the faint scent of rusted steel. Malik bowed his head, not to hide emotion, but to think. Then he asked, without looking up or at anyone in particular, "Does everyone have the courage to do nothing and still keep their conscience?" The question froze the trainers. It wasn't from someone inexperienced. It was from someone who had just grasped the essence of power. It lies not in acting, but in choosing not to act when it isn't needed. The lead instructor, a man with 30 years in the field, gray-haired, calm, stepped forward. No raised voice, no lecture. He said just enough for all to hear. If one man already did it, then you don't get to compromise. That answer, short and without explanation, sank into the minds of the young trainees. They knew the man whom the entire system had once bowed to did nothing, but by doing nothing wrong, he held the line between dignity and reaction, and forced the system to change. Malik said no more. But during training, he was the only one who never raised his hand before confirming the exercise required it. In the suspicious scenario test, he paused and asked, "What has this person done?" before signaling action. In the provocation drill, he didn't respond. When asked why, he said, "Because if someone's silence once made the system stop, I have no right to use my voice to make someone else bow." The small plaque, wrapped in vines and faded brick, was no longer a place for silence. It became a starting point. Not many needed to know it. Only one needed to stand still long enough to see who they are before acting on someone else. And from that year on, instructors kept the tradition. Every first lesson begins at the plaque, not to preach ethics, but to plant a question only a clear conscience can answer. When power is in your hands, will you use it to command or to protect what others still fear to face? The plaque made no sound, but from it many walked away carrying an unspoken reminder. If one person once held on to silence without losing truth, then whoever you are, you no longer have the excuse to turn. After the turning point reforms in law enforcement, General Nathaniel Braxton gradually stepped away from public forums. He declined all political nominations, refused honorary nominations, and held no oversight positions on reform councils. He withdrew from everything quietly, just as he once stepped out of that long-ago moment of suspicion, so no one would focus on rank or title when listening to what he had left behind. The house he chose sat at the base of a hill, beside a small forest in the northern part of the state. There was no gate, no nameplate, just a dirt path leading to a gravel yard where red maple trees turned the ground bright each fall. Locals called it the tea house because anyone who visited, friend or stranger, was met with warm tea and stories that wandered gently without beginning or end. Braxton never retold the past, but he listened and sometimes asked questions, not to argue, but to help the other person reflect on what they carried. He did not preach ethics, did not speak of courage, and never saw himself as the center of any change. One early spring day, a high school student from Atlanta visited. He had written his final paper on the Braxton effect, yet still carried quiet doubts. After a few scattered questions about policing and policy, the student looked across the table at the man pouring tea and softly asked, "Does justice exist?" Braxton did not answer right away. He set the teapot down and turned his gaze toward the far edge of the porch, where an old stone bench sat, moss-covered and cracked from years of wind and wear. Then he smiled, tilted his head toward it, and said, "If it exists, it has to be rewritten every day." The student was silent for a long time. He understood then that Braxton wasn't speaking of justice as something permanent, not a fixed truth, but a journey, one that must be repaired, strengthened, questioned, and, most importantly, seen from places long overlooked. That stone bench was later named the first seat. A small sign was placed behind it, not to recall the past incident, but to preserve something else, the place where he wrote his first report on what he witnessed, not what others told him to believe. From that story on, the students who came no longer asked how to become a hero. They asked how to keep dignity when no one is watching, how to tell courage from pride, speaking up from standing still. Each left with something different, but all understood one thing more clearly. Justice does not come from someone being celebrated, but from many choosing to protect what is right, even when it makes no noise at all. And that was enough. No need for medals, no need for monuments, no honor roll or speeches repeating his name as a political symbol. Nothing more needed to be built because it was his quiet retreat, asking no one to remember, that made him unforgettable. The man once detained on the side of a rural road, who stood still between two raised guns, did not pledge, offered no defense, raised no voice, yet left behind a silence deep enough to reach the conscience of an entire system. He taught others that sometimes what is right does not need to be framed in gold. It needs to be lived daily by those who do not need permission to know what must be done. His scratched badge still rests inside a glass case at the Civil Justice Museum. The small plaque at that old intersection still holds its quiet message. The weathered stone bench, where he once wrote his first report, still catches the wind with each passing season. No one dusts it. No flagpole stands nearby. Yet, each year, young people come, sit in silence, and read words that do not accuse, but open. Because one truth became clear to society after his story. Once truth has been seen, it cannot be unseen. It clings to awareness like a scratch that cannot be polished out. It lives in the cautious glance of a young officer stepping toward someone, in the way a child learns to say, "I am here," without bowing their head, in the quiet guilt of those who once turned away, and in the resolve of those who once stayed silent, now learning to speak. And that is enough so that next time, when someone is questioned just for not looking like they belong, at least one person will pause, will ask again, will not look away, but will choose to stand, not from fear of judgment, but from knowing that silence is no longer a refuge for those with a conscience. This story does not end in victory. It closes with a change, not dramatic, not broadcast live, but from that moment, anyone entering the system carries Braxton's name not as a legend, but as a quiet test. Am I aware enough to see when I'm repeating someone else's mistake, simply because I was never taught to question it? And if one man once held his calm through humiliation, then those who follow no longer have an excuse to act on impulse, because they, now, have seen the truth and seen someone choose to hold it, not by shouting, but by refusing to look away. There is no monument named after Braxton, but somewhere, beside an ordinary roadside, where justice was once broken under the indifference of authority, a small plaque remains. This is where justice was once broken and restored by a great man. He did not stand there to be remembered as a hero. He stood there so that after him, no one would have to bow their head just to be treated as human. Because once the truth has been seen, it cannot be ignored again. And if one person had the calm to walk away from justice, then we, those who follow, no longer have the right to remain silent. If you believe justice belongs beyond the pages of a book, share this story, so that next time when someone is stopped on the street, they are no longer just a victim, but the moment a system learns how to stop at the right time.